Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. We'll be starting in just a few minutes.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Yoca Arditi-Rocha. Welcome to the webinar. I'm the Executive Director of the CLEO Institute, and I will be your host today. But before we begin, a few housekeeping details. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be sent to all registered participants in addition to the slides shown here today. Please note that you're all on mute, and a Q&A will be through the platform function after the presentation of our guest speaker. We will do our best to try to get to all your questions today, but in case we run out of time, please know that we'll do our best to answer them in the follow-up email with the resources mentioned. Additionally, my email and Twitter handle are on the screen in case you want to reach out to me personally. For those of you who don't know us, the CLEO Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan organization exclusively dedicated to climate change, education, advocacy, and engagement here in Florida. For the last decade, the CLEO Institute has been reaching to communities across all levels of society with climate science education while promoting climate action for a just and resilient future. As we get ready to celebrate Earth Day's 50th anniversary tomorrow, we must acknowledge the world we're living is very different from just 3 months ago. We're experiencing a Category 5 political, financial, and economic storms thanks to the coronavirus pandemic. And while we're seeing some signs of nature's own resilience around the world while humans stay indoors, pessimists and optimists are making their assumption of our global world carbon emissions and our climate's fate. A few months ago, top 500 Fortune CEOs couldn't stop talking about their sustainability plans and green investment. Tomorrow, youth global protests are heading online, and carbon-intensive industry from aviation to big oil are looking for bailouts. You probably have heard there's always a side to every story. Not everything is black and white, but many shades of gray. Indeed, if you look at our political system we're living right now, we live in a very partisan world. The COVID-19 pandemic has proven that reducing coal plant energy demands, shutting down factories, and grounding airplanes, to name a few, are reducing pollution levels, and blue skies are showing up in many places around the world, like in China and India. Improvements in air quality recorded in China may have saved the lives of 4,000 children under 5 years old and 73,000 adults over 70. Paradoxically, cleaner air is saving more people's lives than the coronavirus is killing. China's economic slowdown has kept more than 200 megatons of CO2 out of the atmosphere. But as the number of coronavirus cases drop, China has been working hard to restart its economy over the past month. By the beginning of April, energy usage, air pollution levels, and carbon emissions all seem to be on the rebound. Meanwhile, here in the US, a recent study found that while power demand was declining in our own industrial and commercial sectors, millions of Americans stuck at home are driving energy up. However, because transportation is the single biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the US, and because passenger vehicles account for 60% of this emission, the short-term effect of the nation's carbon footprint could be significant. We know the urgency now is to get people back to work. But we can do so with an innovative resilience-focused approach that focuses on non-polluted energy sources that are equitable for all. But while the focus is on health and economic recovery right now, there are fundamental questions that arise that can pose both an opportunity and a challenge. The world has seen an unprecedented response to the COVID-19 crisis. Guided by science, we're seeing governments mobilized to protect people's lives. We can expect a mindset shift open to listen to experts and scientists. It is important to remember that the very same agency the world is relying on today to navigate this pandemic called the climate crisis the biggest threat to public health for the 21st century. Humanity is at a crossroads. NOAA already announced last week global temperatures this year are on track to be among the highest ever recorded. And COVID-19 will teach us many lessons, many of which are still unknown. But what we do know is we need systemic structural change, and this crisis can be a historic opportunity to steer our collective energy and our investment onto a more people-centered, sustainable path. To continue the conversation, it is my pleasure to announce you and introduce you our guest speaker today. Dr. Andrea Dutton is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Department of Geoscience. Her main research focus is to establish the behavior of sea level and polar ice sheets during the past warm periods to better inform us about future sea level rise. Dr. Dutton is active in communicating about the climate crisis. She has testified in the US Senate and is currently joining us from New Zealand, where she's currently on sabbatical studying the links between sea level rise change and Antarctic ice sheet dynamics through time. Dr. Dutton, you may share your screen. Welcome.
Okay, let's see, hold on 1 minute, almost there. Okay, thank you for that nice introduction, Yoca, and thank you to all of you who've taken the time out of your day to be with us for this really important conversation at this time. And yes, I am bringing Earth Day to you live. It is already Earth Day here in New Zealand. It is morning, April 22nd, Wednesday morning. And this whole week, there's a lot of celebrations of Earth Day going on and moments to reflect on where we are both within the midst of this global pandemic and also the climate crisis and all of the challenges that we have facing the Earth today. I hope that for many of you this week, thinking about Earth Day and participating in these conversations gives you a little bit of a chance to reset. I know that on the one hand, the global pandemic gives us all this shared experience, and it's a very traumatic experience, whether you're watching what's happening from afar or whether you are right in the middle of it, and whether you have in fact come down with this coronavirus or one of your loved ones or have even lost someone. In the midst of all that, I recognize it's really gut-wrenchingly hard to focus on anything else sometimes, especially if you're listening to the news as much as I am. But I really think that this week, at least for me, it's really given me a good chance to reset and to refocus, because we need to not lose sight of everything else that's continuing to happen around us and how that intersects with what's going on with the global pandemic right now. So, for example, we are here in isolation in our little bubble, as they call it. We've been that way for just about 4 weeks now. This was supposed to be school holidays, and I was planning to take my children, who were both born in Australia, over to see the Great Barrier Reef this week. We would have been there today, in fact. And as many of you may have heard in the news, or maybe not, maybe it got buried a bit by all the news about the pandemic, is that the Great Barrier Reef is experiencing a mass bleaching event right now. And had we gone, we would have seen this mass bleaching event in person, which would have been a whole nother level of trauma for me, because I, in fact, study coral reefs. So I wanted to take a moment to introduce myself and my work to you before we continue this conversation any further. And I've put my Twitter handle down on the bottom of this screen for those of you who want to use that. So I, for the last 9 years, have been living in Florida, in Gainesville, Florida, working at the University of Florida, and I study past climate and sea level rise. And this picture, for those of you who are tuning in from Florida or even from South Florida, is close to you. This picture was taken in Winley Key Quarry, where they quarried rock that was used to build the railroad that initially connected the Keys to the mainland of Florida. But behind me on this stone wall, you can see a very huge coral head. And that's what I'm looking at to track the position of sea level through time. Corals grow in very shallow water. They need sunlight to survive. And so we can look at the position of fossil reefs through time and see how quickly they grew to understand where sea level was and how quickly it rose during past warm periods. And that's really the main focus of my research. And I can explain it to you in words. It's much better to actually see what I do in the field. And normally, if I were giving you an in-person presentation, I would play you a short video to show you what it looks like when we're actually out there doing work. I'm not going to do that today because I've had some bad experiences playing video over platforms like this. But we will provide you with this link later if you want to go. It's just a 2-minute video that the University of Florida made while I was there that shows you the fieldwork and the type of thing that I do, just so you know kind of my perspective, my background and expertise and where I'm coming from. But as you heard before, I have done a lot of work in this space and talking to public audiences about the climate crisis, both about my own research, but about this issue more broadly as well. So today, what I want to do is take a brief moment to talk a little bit about the science of what's happening in terms of global emissions. We'll look at that very briefly. We've already had a little introduction to that. And then spend most of our time talking about what new perspectives this brings us, the intersection of this global pandemic and the climate crisis. And also then finally, what opportunities that presents for us and where we go from here. So this is kind of going to be a presentation in 3 parts. My plan is to really only take about half the time so that we have a lot of time for Q&A at the end, because I have learned that one of the most important parts about having these conversations is not about talking and throwing information at people. It's actually about listening. And I think that's a good lesson that we can all take forward from here as we have conversations with other people, is listening is a really important part of that. Okay. So as you heard before, and as I'm sure you're well aware, we have had a very dramatic temporary reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. One estimate recently put the reductions in China estimating a 25% reduction or more. I saw another estimate that was on the order of 18%. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty here because we do have satellite data, like you can see on the left side of the screen. Those top panels show you the signal of nitrous oxide, which is a pollutant. It's greenhouse gas. It's associated with the burning of coal, for example, and other things. And you can see over the period of January to February in the top row, obviously we had a lot more pollution than in the bottom row over the same time period this year. So the satellites are still up in orbit, but because many of us are in lockdown, we're not collecting other types of data to really nail down these numbers exactly in terms of understanding what's going on. A lot of field work has had to be halted in many places, except for things like satellites that are still up in the air. What does this mean on a global scale? And also if we think about how might this change our emissions projection for this entire year? So another estimate that was made for that projects perhaps about a 5 to 6% decrease in carbon dioxide emissions over the total year. That number is even more uncertain, of course, because that really depends on human behavior and how long different places are in some type of isolation or lockdown. It depends on the nature of the economic recovery, how quickly that happens, right? So there's a lot of uncertainty in there, but that's one of the estimates that's out there. 5% though is really just a drop in the bucket though, when you look at the bigger picture. How does this compare though with other past events, other past pandemics or recessions? I'm not going to show a lot of graphs, but I thought this one was an interesting one to show because it does compare to some other historical events in terms of looking at the annual change in global emissions in terms of how many millions of tons of carbon dioxide were emitted, or how many less were emitted. And you can see those here compared to the Spanish flu pandemic, 1918, 1919. This is that 5 to 6% drop that is estimated for this year. Obviously, it's much larger than these, but also we're emitting more CO2 today than we were back then for any of these events that we're comparing to. So this is, yes, looks like a big change in comparison to that. But what really matters when it comes to carbon dioxide emissions is the total amount that we are putting into the atmosphere. And that's what's going to have the impact on our climate. So how does this estimated 5% reduction compare to what we would need if we wanted to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees? This was a target that was extensively talked about in a report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This report came out in 2018 that talked about this 1.5 degrees Celsius target. So to reach that, global emissions would need to fall by about 7.6% every year this decade, but in combination with also using some type of technology of carbon capture to actually draw down how much carbon is in the atmosphere. Without that carbon capture technology, it would require 15%. So this is interesting perspective. You can say, well, this is great. We've stopped flying. We're not driving around. We've had this instantaneous reduction, but it's still not even getting to the levels of what we would need to do to get to this target. That may sound a little bit depressing. We're going to come back to that a little bit later. But recognize that our cumulative emissions are still going up all the time. So when I say 5% reduction, that's reduction in comparison to how much we thought we were going to emit this year. We're still adding more. And that's what matters. The more that this goes up, the more greenhouse gases we add to the atmosphere, the more warning we have, and the more domino effect impacts that we get out of that. So in the news yesterday was also this really rather spectacularly amazing piece of information. US oil finished at negative $37. You might think, how is it even possible for a barrel of oil to be valued at a negative value? What this means is that the sellers were actually paying the buyers to store the oil for them. So oil production has already been scaled back, recognizing that people are not using as much right now. There's also a price war that's going on that superimposes on top of this, but this really precipitous drop had to do with a particular deadline in the way that oil is sold and then stored, kind of a monthly deadline. And at this moment, they realize we are out of space to store all of this oil. And so this is causing a huge problem. This market is very volatile, right? And that's one of the things about relying on fossil fuels is the volatility of this. You can't just turn off the taps for some technical reasons in oil wells. And so it's very hard for them to be able to respond to such large changes like this. But this also presents some opportunities for us as well when we think about it. So that's a little bit about the science of what's going on in terms of global emissions right now, and gives you context of how that compares to some of these different targets that we are trying to reach to sustain a more livable climate. So now I want to talk a little bit more about perspectives and different perspectives that we have. We're going to come back to this cartoon a little bit later. It's one of my favorite ones, I think, that has emerged over the past couple of weeks. I started trying to make a list of a whole bunch of different perspectives, and it's just not possible for us to have all the time to talk about them or to even fit them on one slide because there are a lot. So I've highlighted some here, and I'm going to separate them into two different columns here to think about. There are a lot of different perspectives out here, and Yoca alluded to this in the beginning. There's the pessimist and the optimist. And in many cases, we're looking at the same thing and having two totally different perspectives about it because we are so entrenched in our different political parties and mindsets that we see it from one angle only. And so we're going to think about this kind of from all angles. So an optimist point of view is that we can see what a big impact collective action can make. we can make a difference as individuals. And I think that's a really big lesson that comes out of this. We stay at home, we're not spreading the disease as much, and we can have a big impact. But also with the fossil fuel emissions, obviously, we're not driving around as much and so forth. That has a big difference as well. Also, we've seen something that surprised a lot of people. We can actually respond very quickly to a crisis if we have the political will to do so, right? And that's always been the big challenge for us in terms of climate action. So, and this is true, you know, it's a huge amount of money that we're talking about, the stimulus packages in the United States, as well as other countries around the world right now, responding to the economic crisis that is paired with the pandemic. So even with those large upfront costs, you know, the money is there in a sense, you have to borrow it, but it's there if we want it to be. So if we see it as urgent enough, we can act. And I think that's reason for optimism. The decrease in emissions, as Yoca alluded to before, has had positive effects, less pollution that can have very direct impacts on our health. And the climate crisis is very much about our health and human health. It is in fact one of the things that really motivates me to do a lot of work in the public space on this. A lot of times I often say this, people think that my work is about saving planet Earth, which is an interesting perspective here on Earth Day. I don't think of it that way because I'm a geologist and I know that the planet is going to survive. What we're really talking about here is the survival of humans on this Earth and how that is going to play out. So to me, talking about the climate crisis and acting on it is very much a matter about saving human lives and sustaining that. So more reason for optimism is that there are a lot of opportunities that this creates for us, and we're going to get to that a bit later in how we decide to go about rebuilding our economy as we come out of this. And a lot of people have been talking about, well, maybe this is a big turning point for us. People might come out of this experience on the other side with a very different perspective. I see that argument, but okay, the pessimist in me, if we have to be honest, and I think all of us can identify sometimes with some things in both of these columns, we're not all optimists or all pessimists, is that we've been through a lot of tipping points before in the climate system. This year, one particularly profound for me was watching the Australian bushfires. I lived in Australia for 7 years. I mentioned before, both of my children were born there. One would hope that that's all it would take to make people say, okay, we really have to do something about this now. But I'm sure many people have already forgotten about this, especially given what happened on the heels of it. So we've been through this before. You know, maybe this is the hurricane or the wildfire that's going to change everyone's mind. But will it? And I can't answer that question now. There's still a lot to play out. And as we know, the landscape is changing very quickly every day and every month at the moment. So if you look at the things on this right side, it's kind of the counterpart to what's on the left. Collective action, you might say, well, we've reduced our emissions, but not by nearly enough. And also, we haven't done it in the right way because it's not sustainable for all of us to just sit in our homes all of the time. What we really need is a large systemic change. The good news about that is that those technologies are there already. And there's not just one solution, there's lots of different solutions, and we know how to do it. It's not like this disease that we're just learning about. We don't understand how it's transmitted or what the fatality rate is or all these different things that we're learning on the fly. We've been studying the climate crisis for decades upon decades. And so we understand what needs to be done. And so I would say don't dwell on that one particularly too much, but I think this is a lesson about collective action being able to make a difference. Even if it hasn't had enough of an effect yet, we know how to get there, and that's the positive thing to take away. So I'm not going to read through all of this list. You've probably been reading through it while I've been talking, and we're going to share all of this with you afterward. This is being recorded, so you can come back to this later. But you can take different angles. You can be optimist or you can be pessimist. But I think really out of this lesson, what we need to learn to do is to come together. And I tend to call myself perhaps more of a realist rather than anything else, rather than optimist or pessimist, because to be honest, it depends on my mood as to which day it is and whether I'm being an optimist or a pessimist, as I'm sure all of you can relate to. So the realist perspective is, what have we learned even already out of this crisis. This pandemic really provides us with a globally shared experience that highlights how we are so interconnected with each other and how our individual actions can translate to a greater common good. I really like this image because it shows us this very thin layer of the atmosphere over planet Earth. And this very thin layer is what we rely on, and it is shared by all of us. And so we have to think about this issue of the climate crisis from a global perspective. Even if you haven't contributed to the problem, you don't think you have, you will be affected by it because we are all connected through the atmosphere, through the oceans, through our ecosystems. And as we see through our transportation sector that's been passing around this epidemic, this disease between us. What else have we learned? I think we've recognized that actions that benefit all of us, it's not a matter of our political party. Climate's going to affect all of us, just as this disease affect everyone. Although, yes, the disease has hit some people harder, and so will the climate crisis. And there's a vast unfairness in the way that this plays out, in the way that more vulnerable populations, those who are underrepresented in governments, don't have as much of a voice in policy, do get hit the hardest. But these actions we've learned to have a collective good, and that benefits all of us, regardless of where we come from or who we are. I think another heartening thing is that people are willing to act for the collective good. A recent survey that came out from the Yale Climate Communications Group showed us that people really are on board with the stay-at-home movement in the United States, regardless of their political party affiliation or where else they come from. If they perceive the problem as urgent enough, they are willing to act. And that's certainly a challenge with the climate crisis because it's slow moving, it's incremental, it's ongoing. And so for many people, it doesn't appear as urgent, even though the problem may in fact be bigger. Many people, as we come out of this, might be willing to make some behavioral changes now that they've already, in a way, been forced to test them out. Some people are learning they like to work from home, at least sometimes, maybe not all of the time, and are realizing that there are ways that they can change their lives that they can live with and they can do moving forward that will lower their carbon footprint and then maybe encourage others to do the same. I think one of the most important things, and I will come back to this at the end again, is that we've learned the importance of our communities. Many of us who are staying at home, really relying on the people close to us, nearby, who are around us, people who are deemed as essential workers who might be delivering our food or collecting our trash, people who we might have undervalued before, and we can now see how wrong that was and how important the communities, but the people in those communities are to us. And I think that value of learning how we can all work together to contribute to shared goals is certainly a lesson that many of us will emerge from this pandemic with. But yes, our biggest challenge is that we do need political will to achieve the magnitude of the change that's required to tackle the climate crisis, which brings me to the presidential election in the United States. This quote that I read the other day really nails it on the head for me, is that the political will to act on climate change will be confirmed or set back by the outcome of the US presidential election, which is the most important event of the year for the climate agenda. Not the little Earth Day, of course, which is an important day, but I think this is incredibly important, and it impacts not just what happens in the United States, but around the world in terms of setting an example, of providing leadership, of not moving backwards in terms of all of the environmental protections that have been removed over the past 3 years at a frightening speed, but a moment where we can change that momentum and move forward. So if I know that the CLEO Institute does a lot of work training people as climate activists and learning about climate change and the climate crisis. So if there's one thing you really want to throw yourself into, I would say this is it. This is going to be really important for us this year as we move forward. Okay, on that note, opportunities. What opportunities present ourselves? And this is the image that came out with the announcement of this webinar. I love this image because it reminds me of the Robert Frost poem, The Road Not Taken. I went to Amherst College as an undergrad. Robert Frost taught there for on and off for about 40 years or so. And so this is kind of deep in my roots, thinking about the road less traveled and whether that's the one you want to take. I'm going to come back to this image later again to think about this in two paths, or maybe to think about it a little bit differently. Okay, so in terms of opportunities, and in particular, what opportunities you have individually coming out of this, there are so many teaching moments in front of us right now. I love these cartoons that John Cook creates, and some of you may have come across his work before. He has just released a book called The Cranky Uncle, because we all always talk about, you know, the cranky uncle at the Thanksgiving dinner table who you need to convince about something. So that's kind of where that comes from. And he talks about critical thinking skills and points out different fallacies that are common kind of techniques that are used by climate denialists when they're talking about the climate crisis. And he's made a bunch of cartoons now that go along with this pandemic as well. And so when people learn about basically how this misinformation is being perpetuated, how facts are being distorted by these different fallacies, it's a moment to teach them how to think critically about the information in front of them and to be better assessors and consumers of that information. So here you see this cartoon. Fact is that COVID-19 is deadlier than the flu. The myth is that, well, maybe fewer people have died already, so it's less of a threat. At least that was true at one stage, perhaps not anymore. Fallacy is, you know, this is slothful induction. You know, this is like jumping off of the roof of the building, being halfway to the bottom and saying, hey, I feel fine, there's no problem here, even though we can see the problem is definitely coming. And we know from science what is coming. John Cook is also creating, I should say, a app for your phone that's going to be forthcoming in a couple of months. I'm really excited for this, and it's going to be a great way to share this information. This is another great one. Forecast was for rain, but I'm dry. I guess I can get rid of this umbrella, right? And this relates to this whole conversation about the staying at home and whether we're ready to move out of that phase if we have enough testing in place and so forth to safely come out of our homes without a risk of a second peak in the pandemic. If what we're doing is working, if we stop doing it, then we know exactly what's going to happen unless we have the right measures in place. Another opportunity comes out is there are so many different parallels that we can talk about here that can serve as motivators for people to act on the climate crisis. And we come back to this cartoon again. People have been talking about flattening the curve. There are actions that we can take that can make the problem not as bad. And this is what the climate crisis is really all about. But with all analogies, it's not perfect, but what this cartoon does portray is that the climate crisis, you know, it will also take a lot of lives, if that's what we're talking about on the vertical axis here. And it is a huge problem looming in our future. We can't stop it altogether, but we can somewhat flatten the curve, if you will. We can make it doesn't have to be as bad as it's going to be, depending on our actions, and our actions can make a difference. And so that's this real value that I see in here. So what other opportunities do we have? Rebuilding our economy is a huge one. You can turn to just about any of your local papers right now and see op-eds by the dozen talking about, here we have a moment where we actually need some type of economic stimulus, some maybe New Deal-like plan, and we have one waiting in the wings. Maybe we don't call it by that name if that turns off people, but the reality is what we need to do moving forward is to rebuild in a way that increases the sustainability of our society, in part by decreasing our dependence on fossil fuels. And that is, of course, a major goal moving forward. I am a climate scientist. I am not a climate policy wonk, but they have done this hard work for us already in crafting plans and policies that can help us to tackle the climate crisis. And I am advertising for another event that is happening for you tomorrow. If you want to tune into this online, there's a great another webinar and panel that's happening online that talks more about this if you're interested in learning more about these policies. This would be a great place to get more information for that. Empowerment is also a big one. So when I give public lectures, people always say, you know, this is such scary information. But on the other hand, I say, but we understand what's going on, and that should be empowering. As my colleague Kate Marvel likes to say sometimes, it's not like we don't understand what's happening to our climate. It's not like, or that we don't have control of it. It's not like the Earth is rocketing towards the sun quickly and that's why we're heating up. That would be really hard to do something about, but we know what's happening. And we also know that we are part of that problem. And so we can also be that solution. So this moment teaches us again that we can make choices to act collectively to change the arc of history. And I've come back to this image because I think that moving forward, it's really important for us to not think about our options as being either or. Here we go down this path, or we go down the other one. In part because there's not just one solution, not just one path to go down, but also because it's not that black and white. There is a huge amount of space in between where we can think creatively and meet each other across our shared values to move forward in a way that's beneficial for all of us, including planet Earth and including sustaining all of us together. And so that's really one of my, I think, overarching takeaways from this. So what I want to end on is this picture that's been circulating on social media this week, which really tugs at my heart. These are some fairy penguins that live on the coast of Australia. I've been down there to see these little penguins scurrying across the beach at nighttime when they come into their nests. These penguins mate for life. What you're looking at here is this colony has been very well studied, so they know all the individual penguins. The one on the right is an elderly female penguin who's a widow, lost her mate. And the one on the left is a younger male who also lost his mate. And it turns out that every evening they come out and stand on the rocks together for hours, standing at and looking here at the Melbourne skyline that's in front of them. And it's this companionship and community and being there for each other, which I find really touching, and I think really speaks to the moment that we're in. In times of crisis, it really does help us to strengthen our bonds within our communities. I'm sure a lot of us are getting to know our neighbors better than we ever knew them before. And that's a really important process because we will come out of that by having built stronger communities and recognizing the value, and that will help us to adopt policies that protect all of us collectively, rather than focusing on just what benefits me individually the best. We realize the value of that community around us. And that's true in terms of the people as well as the environment that we share in that community that we all depend on to survive. And I think that that can really help us to build the political will that we need to act on climate change. So I'm going to leave my presentation there, and we can open things up to questions. I think maybe I need to stop sharing my screen first, though. Here we go.
Thank you, Andrea. Great presentation, and I love that story. I'm in love with those penguins. I do believe that we're going to come out of this crisis stronger. We have several questions already coming in, but please, if you, for those of you still with us, put your questions in the Q&A. We'll try to get to them as many as we can. I'll start with a few ones as they continue to come in. Andrea, somebody is asking, why do you think climate continues to be a partisan issue when the science is so clear and we know about our causal effect on global temperatures?
Yeah, that's a great question. Why is it so partisan when clearly it would be to all of our benefit to act on this? part of that stems from the massive misinformation campaign that has been funded at the tune of tens of millions of dollars over the past couple decades by fossil fuel companies. And they've been out there sending some very confusing, misleading, and just plain wrong messages about what is going on. And that makes it very hard for people to know what the truth is. And they feel like they are getting correct information when they're not. And it depends on where they're getting their news from, in addition. But really what it comes down to is that they see themselves maybe as part of a group, whether it's their community or their political party. And when someone says something that threatens their sense of identity within that group, their natural reaction is to fight back, right? And that honestly goes for all of us, I have to say. I mean, we can't just be pointing the fingers there. And so that's why it's so important when we do have conversations with other people and other people with different opinions, which is something I think we all need to work at more, because in the day and age of social media, which we've fallen into probably even more and more as we're sitting at home, it's very easy to be within our bubbles and only talk to people and hear opinions of people who all have the same view. But the more that we talk to other people, take the opportunity to connect across shared values, whatever it may be. It may be that you both like to go fishing, you both like to go to the beach, you both have kids. It can be as simple as that. But I think when you realize you have the conversations around those shared values and you think about how the climate crisis impacts that, and at the same time, you listen to what they have to say and ask them, how do you feel about this? How does it make you feel? Where did you get this information? Or why did you believe it? Or what leads you to think that? And to have the conversation, but really listen to them, I think we will make a lot of progress moving forward.
Indeed. Well, we have a lot of questions coming in, so I won't take time on commenting because obviously I want to continue this conversation. But there's an interesting one here that says, it's an interesting perspective that it appears that those countries that are leading on dealing with COVID are also the first to deal with climate. What do you think of that perspective?
That may have something to do with political leaders who are willing to listen to scientists, because that's what these both really have in common, right? Are we listening to the experts, the epidemiologists who are telling us they've been studying this, this is their bread and butter. They understand the dynamics of how diseases spread. So when politicians are willing to listen to the scientists and make policies that are based on that evidence, that's when we see action in those directions. So I think that's really the most simple answer to that.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think that's probably the biggest lesson we have already identified coming from this pandemic related to the climate crisis. And in relation to that, somebody's asking about the current EPA deregulation and all the EPA rollbacks that the current administration it's using under the COVID smokescreen. What do you think about that? Do you have any comments?
Yeah, and that partly was what fueled my comments at the very beginning of the presentation about Earth Day being a chance for us to kind of reset and think about this and not turn a blind eye to what's going on around us right now. It's easy to become entrenched in the pandemic and think about nothing else, but they are using this moment to roll back a lot of regulations that it's really quite scary, on top of everything that they've already done to this point. So we need to stay on our game and make sure that we're not just watching what's happening, but pushing back and figuring out how we can move this forward again. And so this is, some people say, never let a good crisis go to waste, right? But we really need to, they always say it's the wrong time to be talking about the climate crisis, right? No, not in the middle of the global pandemic, not in the middle of the hurricane. The answer is it's always the right time. And so never forget that.
Yeah, agreed. And so with this, it's an interesting question. Somebody's asking, should we, you allured to that, obviously we could consider going to a 4-day work week for, sectors that can do that. But what do you think about a global, Earth Month, similar to the like of Earth Hour, when we shut down the lights for 1 hour and we give, the planet a breather? Could we be advocating to do a worldwide shutdown? Will that make any difference as far as emissions? I mean, obviously we have seen kind of that particular experiment on plan right now, but somebody's asking if that's something that we should be advocating for.
So that's a great question. But one thing you have to remember is this choice to stay at home is really has a big socioeconomic divide. There are those of us who can afford to do that very easily, and many who just simply cannot. And the other thing is that, so at the beginning of my presentation, I talked about how much of a reduction of emissions it is, and it's really just touching the sides of what we need to do. Even if we were to do temporary reductions, we're not addressing the real problem, is that the need for systemic change. Where we get our energy from, what energy we use for transportation, and that type of thing. That's what really needs to be addressed, rather than temporarily hitting the off button. And we can see, yeah, there's some immediate benefits that fall out of that, the immediate reductions in pollution and so forth. But to really address this issue, we need to focus on electing leaders who will enact policies that will change the systems of which we are a part and that we rely on.
Exactly. And somebody here wants to know, why do you think the world was so quickly to react to the coronavirus and yet don't see the urgency behind the climate crisis?
Right. So that's a great question. And I think that's really just the dynamics of how quickly it played out, right? So this disease spreads so quickly, and that literally adds up to people dying extremely quickly. And it's really quite clear why that's happening, right? They have all the same symptoms and they can see that connection very clearly. So it becomes a very urgent and pressing problem. That exponential growth, I think a lot of people who maybe weren't aware of even that term, maybe have a new appreciation for what they learned in math class in high school, perhaps. So because of the speed at which that traveled and moved around the world, that caused that quick reaction. And I alluded to this before in saying the climate crisis, it's this incremental problem. This gets a little bit worse, a little bit worse each year in a way, in terms of greenhouse gas concentrations. But at certain points, we cross tipping points, like, for example, with the Great Barrier Reef right now, these mass bleaching events. And I think we really need to help people to connect those dots to understand how this gradual change will lead to very sudden changes that will have huge impacts where you can't just dial them back, right? The Australian bushfires, all that landscape is burned, those homes are lost, that ecosystem has taken a huge hit. And that's not something you can easily recover from. And so the more we can help people to connect those dots, I think the more they will realize how urgent the climate crisis is also.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the things we do at the CLEO Institute is to try to help people connect those dots. And you mentioned the Yale climate change studies about, people's perception. And indeed, it has increased due to the increase in extreme weather events here in South Florida. Actually in Florida in general, more than 70% of Floridians acknowledge the climate is changing, yet only 50% think that it's going to personally affect them. So there's that
Right.
kind of frog boil syndrome happening, if you will. The water slowly is starting to warm up, but we're not feeling it. So rapidly, like we have seen the pandemic cross borders and getting to our shores so quickly in a real timeline. We have another question that says, what leaders are opposed to, hold on, let me see. Okay, so one question from a teacher says, is how do you suggest teachers share climate crisis information with students without risking pushback from administration and parents?
Yeah, that's a challenging thing to do. And I think as long as whatever you're doing is rooted in the science and the evidence, that you can't go wrong in that sense. I was looking at, as I put together this presentation, those cartoons from John Cook about fallacies, and I thought, this is such a great tool that teachers could use to teach children about critical thinking skills. And you could use those for the pandemic and also for the climate crisis. And you could see so maybe if you talk about it in terms of multiple issues, right, and use these parallels to your advantage, so it's not all focused on climate, you say, well, really, we're teaching the children how to think critically, and to do so using scientific evidence as a basis for that, then I think that is a good pathway to follow. I can't promise you that you're not going to get parents pushing back. I have taught 3rd to 12th graders. I've also taught in a university setting, and I know there are lots of different opinions out there, and you will get pushback. I think the important thing again is to listen to people, but also just stay rooted in the science and in the critical thinking skills, and that's a great way forward.
Yeah, and I have to agree. We at the CLEO Institute have a climate resilient schools program in Miami-Dade County schools, and all our presentations and our workshops are rooted in science. We don't get into the political discourse, and we never hardly get any pushback. So I think that's really good, important feedback. Another interesting question that was brought up is, as we get to celebrate Earth Day 50th anniversary, it's important to remember that the reason why Earth Day was first adopted was because the amount of air pollution we were seeing in our environment. People were choking in many parts of our country, and also this is what really brought us the EPA, founded by President Nixon. It seems kind of ironic, and somebody is asking, wouldn't this be some kind of deja vu, calling people to really unite behind protecting people's life and health? Shouldn't we pivot our messaging to a more health, people-centered kind of messaging and drop probably the controversial climate term that has been politicized for so long?
I agree that emphasizing impacts on human health are really central to talking about this issue, but I don't think there's one way. I think that different approaches will work with different people, but I think talking about that historical context really is a source of hope, if you will, because around this movement there was big change at the government level, and so coming out of this on the other side, we may see some big changes at the governmental level, having all gone through this together, particularly in light of the pandemic. Yes, I think it's a great opportunity to talk about the impacts of climate on human health, and there are a lot. And as I said before, that is really one of the things that motivates me, as I feel like I have a moral and ethical responsibility to talk about my work because of the impact that it has on us personally and collectively. It will have huge impacts on human lives. And so I think that is a very important point that we need to continue on, but recognizing that there are a lot of other impacts as well.
Yeah. Another question is, as the economy begins to open up, people will likely rush to recapture what has been given up during the shutdown, returning to travel, transportation, and extensive use of fossil fuels. What do you think needs to happen immediately to preclude the rush to return on, to the old ways? And similar to what you've just been talking about, but perhaps you want to add additional feedback.
Yeah, and some people have been talking about that, and maybe we've had a temporary reduction. Maybe when we come back, we're going to overshoot, and it will completely cancel out any reduction that we have, and that's totally a possibility. But this really speaks to the issue of what we need to do is to promote systemic change. We need to cut our reliance on fossil fuels. It's not that we can't go to work or travel around to some extent. We'll still be able to do that, but we need to get our energy from renewable sources rather than relying on fossil fuels. We need to rebuild our communities and focus on a lot of the different priorities that all of the different climate policies point to in terms of developing housing and so forth. There are a lot of different approaches that we can take there. You may be muted, Yoca.
Yes, I was. Well, we're coming to the end of our webinars, and there's still a few questions to see how many we can get to as of now. Will this presentation be shared today? I think we can make that happen. What do you think, Dr. Dutton?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm more than happy for this to be shared with everyone.
Okay, so we'll try to get this out today to you, but if not, latest tomorrow, you'll get her, Dr. Dutton's presentation and also the recording of this webinar. One quick question says, what do you have to say for scientists who are bought by companies and give false information on the current state of our world? and our climate?
There are really not very many of them. This perception that we're all somehow benefiting financially from promoting this information or from just doing the work that we do. There are very few of them, but their voices get lifted up by very powerful people who have a lot of money. And it's very easy to point them out because they claim to have expertise across whole ranges of issues. So the same people who were climate denialists and very vocal on this are now the very same people who are pushing back against what epidemiologists are saying about this global pandemic. And so it's very easy to target and see who those people are. And I think what we need to do is figure out a way that they don't get their signal boosted, if you will. And that's very hard in the current media landscape. And it's hopefully something that can improve in the future.
Great. Well, I wanted to just make a couple of announcements. The CLEO Institute will be hosting other webinars in the next couple of days, so please stay tuned with our event calendar. I just posted it on the chat. I wanted to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Dutton for her time, for her very thorough and wonderful presentation. I think this is the time where I'm going to ask you, Andrea, for your final words and perhaps give us some of your, what would you feel right now everybody can do today as an individual, since we're calling for collective action?
So what I always say to people is that what we have to do more of is to talk to each other about the climate crisis. And we've already touched on this several times. They can be hard conversations to have, but they are very important. And I think at the same time as talking about it is also being honest with each other. And this is something I think I really recognized recently I fall down on sometimes, because oftentimes people will look to me to be the beacon of hope, tell us something hopeful. I'm glad you didn't say that, Yoca, because that's usually the question I get asked at the end. Give us hope. Mm-hmm. Well, we all have to find our own hope, and it's not so much hope, but courage to face this and to have these conversations and to move forward. And my honesty to you today is that, yes, sometimes I find this really depressing. It's hard to deal with right now on top of the global pandemic. It's very easy to get down about it. It's not like a traditional maybe cycle of grief in terms of when you lose someone from your life or something that you can come out on the other side because they're gone. This climate problem is ongoing. It's not like we solve it and we move on. It's ongoing. And so we cycle through these different phases of anger and frustration and despair and depression. But I think remembering that talking to each other, connecting with each other, and being part of the solution is really the best way forward. And so I hope we can all take that viewpoint as we leave from here today.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. Well, again, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. I know it's early in New Zealand. You probably haven't even had breakfast yet, but we do appreciate you being
my coffee.
Good. I'm glad that you did. We did have some more questions coming in, and we'll try to answer them in the follow-up email as mentioned. Again, thank you so much. We wish you luck in your studies in New Zealand, and we'll be in touch soon again. Thank you again, everybody. Have a great afternoon or a great morning wherever you are today. Bye-bye.